In this video, I'm going to give a quick overview of ghost primitives and folders in InsightMaker. These are tools that allow us to reduce the visual complexity of our diagrams and make logical subgroupings that are similar to the sectors that we've described in class. So as a review, if we have a very large stock and flow diagram, we might want to group dynamic variables into clusters that we might call sectors, and then have those sectors be kind of viewed as a high-level map of what's going on. And so you can have one sector is participating with another, or is interacting with another sector because there are some causal links that go between them, but inside a sector, there's a lot of dynamical variables that are very tightly integrated with each other, more tightly integrated than any variables in between sectors are with each other. And so it makes sense to kind of make these groupings so that you don't get a large mass of stocks and flows onto one diagram when effectively you don't kind of need to see all of them at one time. All right, so I'm starting here with our simple bacterial population model, and you might imagine that if you've got these bacterial population dynamics, they might affect the population dynamics of another population that they infect. And so I could create a sort of bacteria sector, and its population dynamics will run, and I could create another sector called like a human sector that has human population dynamics, and then those human population dynamics will be affected by whatever's going on in the bacteria sector, and maybe vice versa. But they don't have to all be inside one sort of sector. So what I can do is I can highlight all of these variables and their links there too. And then I can go up to this thing and say I want to make a folder. And this folder, so this is kind of funny how this is drawn here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on each one of the variables here and try to reposition it kind of in the middle here. This is one of the headaches in working with folders in InsightMaker, is moving things within the folders. So try to get this more in the middle here. All right, that doesn't look too bad. I can also adjust the boundaries a bit. Okay. And then I can, let me see if I can move this down a little bit. All right, that's good enough. Then I can name this the bacteria sector maybe. So I could just call it bacteria, but I'm going to call it bacteria sector just to make it clear that this is not the same name. These don't have to be named the same. And you can imagine much more complicated stock and flow models inside this sector. And then notice there's a little collapse box here, so I can collapse this away, and now it just says bacteria sector, and I can then expand that. So, all right, I've collapsed that away. Now I might then create a new stock down here called infected humans. And that stock is going to have some flow going into it. So I drag and pull out, and then this flow is going the wrong direction, so I hit reverse connection direction, rename this infection rate, and so this here is kind of like a humans sector. So I might, so if this was a lecture on SIR models or something, I would have created a lot more stocks, like a stock of susceptible humans, a stock of infected humans, a stock of recovered humans, and I would have had all of those relationships around. But this is just sort of a demonstration of sectors and ghost primitives in InsightMaker, so the models here are kind of necessarily primitive and unrealistic. And so this is our model of the kind of human population that we care about. And if I wanted to, I could then highlight both of these dynamic variables and put them inside their own folder. So apparently I didn't. I'm going to undo that. So it looks like let's just expand. Well, that's strange. So everything looks like it's selected. Let me make this a little smaller. Add that folder, and it insists on drawing the flow outside the folder. All right, so what I'm going to try to do here is move these. Again, I mentioned a second ago that one of the headaches of Insight Maker is dealing with, there we go, is dealing with moving things within folders. But now I've got both of these dynamic variables are inside this folder. I'm going to make this folder a little bigger because I'm going to be adding things to it here in a second. So select both of those, move them down, and then this folder I can call the humans sector. So now I've got these two sectors, the bacteria sector and the human sector. Maybe I'll call it the human sector. So I got bacteria sector and human sector, and right now they don't interact. So if I open these two things up, then I can add an interaction. So one thing that I can do is I can say, well, I want my infection rate of the humans to depend upon the bacteria. So I'm going to click a link, and I'm going to drag a link down from bacteria to infection rate. And that allows me to go into the infection rate and update its formula. So if I were to click on infection rate, click on equals, then this would normally allow me to edit the formula here. And sometimes Insight Maker gets confused and won't bring up the formula editor. And I'm end up being stuck and have to reopen Insight Maker. So let's do that. And if we're lucky, it should have all our work saved. It does. And then now, I think I will be able to open the formula editor. There it is. And so now I can say, well, I want this flow rate to be the number of bacteria times 0.2 or something like that. And so now, if I were to collapse this sector and collapse this sector, then I can see that this sector this sector depends upon this sector. And that is an informative view. And so that might be good enough. If you, think about in our Moorcroft textbook that we've been using in class, when he defines sector maps, this actually looks a lot like the sector maps that he defines. But the downside of that is that inside the human sector here, if I look at infection rate, I don't actually know which dynamic variable infection rate depends on. Now, of course, if I click on infection I can see that this flow rate depends upon bacteria, but I might want to make it more clear inside this sector which dynamic variables depend on this. And so what I can do is I can put a copy of bacteria inside this sector. So I'm going to delete this link. Then I'm going to go and open up bacteria sector, and I'm going to click on bacteria, and I'll say add primitive, ghost primitive. And this creates, notice, a slightly lighter colored version of bacteria. In Vensim, this is nearly identical to something called a shadow variable. So a ghost primitive is basically just a copy of the defined variable that we have up here. And so you can create them. They don't have to be stocks. I could also create a ghost primitive of other variables here. So a ghost primitive of average lifetime. Notice it also looks like a lightly colored version of average lifetime. Now, a big difference between a ghost primitive and a shadow variable in Vensim is that in Vensim, if you delete the shadow variable, it will then delete the defined variable at the same time, and that's really annoying. Fortunately, in Insight Maker, if I delete the shadow variable, then the defined variable hangs around. Well, I can take this shadow variable and move it into a different sector. So now, even though bacteria, the defined variable, lives in the bacteria sector, it has a mirrored copy that lives over here in the human sector. And so I can now create a link from this bacteria over to infection rate. And then I'm going to have to redo that formula. What I thought I would I have a feeling that I'm actually going to have to, no, no, it looks like that would have kept. And so I've got the same formula as I had before, but now the dependency is clear inside the human sector. The downside of that change is that now these two sectors look like they're not related anymore. But the upside here is that if I'm just looking at the human sector, I can very quickly see exactly what each one of these things depend on. What works best for you is going to vary. I mean, sometimes one's going to be more aesthetically pleasing than another. Sometimes it will be very useful to know exactly what dynamic variable it depends upon. Sometimes it'll be more useful just to know that there's something in this sector that depends upon. And if you want to see what it actually depends upon, you have to open the sector. There's no right or wrong answer to this, but there's just kind of two ways to make use of these. So there you have it. We have folders and ghost variables. And an advantage of the ghost variables is they prevent having to draw long. So even without the folders, you could still create ghost variables if you didn't want to create, say, long links that cross other links. So it's a way of cleaning up that. But then, as a side effect, they also allow you to create copies of variables in other sectors inside sectors just when they're needed. And so this looks much like the inside Moorcroft. When you look at a particular sector, he always has a copy of all the variables that these depend upon. So there's not just a link trailing off into infinity somewhere. And so that's kind of one of the advantages of having these ghost variables. But again, the disadvantage is then the link between sectors when you're just in the sector view disappears. And now it looks like humans don't depend on these bacteria whatsoever. Oh, but I also should probably make sure that everything runs now. So I'll hit simulate and see if I get any errors. And of course it does because there's units have been defined here. And so it's complaining because bacteria is in units of bacters, but infected humans is not. And so in order to get this thing to run, I also would have to deal with these units issues here. So I might, so just as an exercise, maybe I'll go into infection rate, and I'll actually say this is 0.2, humans per bacters, humans per bacter. And I'll make this unit humans per minute. I'll go into this one, make this unit humans. Is that enough? Humans per minute and got humans. All right, so this, right, and so this needs to be, so this is in units of bacter, and now this comes out in units of humans, and then so I will then say, all right, and this is going to be in units, and that should give me the humans per minute. Yes, and it does. So if I plot the infected humans, then, so let's say I'll, under default display here, I'll configure and I will add in bacteria and infected humans. And then so now I can see that bacteria are growing at a particular rate and infected humans are growing at a particular rate. So they both are simulated properly. So there you have it, a properly running simulation inside Insight Maker making use of folders for sectors and ghost variables. I'm sorry, ghost primitives.